Alright, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel, and I'm glad you're back because today I have a good one for you. And I think this is actually going to provide some people with a lot of value because today is another shootout. And on today's shootout, we have two shoes that are going head to head that are fairly different, and yet they're not. They're very similar. Today we have a shootout between the New Balance 1080 version 14 and the New Balance 880 version 15. Let's get into it. All right, first of all, I do just want to say thank you to Roadrunner Sports because they were good enough to send me both the 1080 version 14 and the 880 version 15 for the purpose of review. However, no one at Roadrunner Sports has told me what to say. They don't have any editorial privileges, and all the thoughts and opinions are my own. Now look, you are going to be able to pick up both of these at Roadrunner Sports, so of course I'm going to place a link in the show notes below in case you want to head on over and pick either of these up for yourself. And if you do, you'll be able to pick up a pair of the New Balance 880 version 15 for $140, or you'll be able to pick up a pair of the New Balance 1080 version 14 for $165. And look, moving forward, because I am going to mix up the version 14 and version 15, I already did it. It's version 15 and version 14. I'm going to mix that up. From now, moving forward, this will be the 1080 and this will be the 880. All right, you know that these are the newest versions as of the making of this video. So as far as fitting into the New Balance lineup goes, the 880 is kind of like a mid-range daily trainer, and that is going up against the 1080, which is New Balance's premium daily trainer. And guys, if you are already a fan of New Balance, you have heard of both of these. And as far as New Balance shoes go, they are both wildly popular. Now, they are fairly different, and they are going to appeal to different runners. But before we talk about the differences, I think we should talk about the similarities, because in actual fact, on paper, it looks like New Balance is making the 880 a lot more like the 1080. I mean, spoiler, it's really not. But on paper, it looks like it. So just a reminder, before we get into all the specs, the 1080 is $25 more than the 880. So let's get started with the 880. Oh, in fact, before we get started with the 880, let me just say that both the 880 and the 1080 fit true to size. I wear a US men's size 12.5 in both of these shoes, and in fact all New Balance shoes, and it fits me the same as all other New Balance shoes. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you may see me wearing a US men's size 13, and that is true with a lot of brands. But with New Balance, I find that when I'm wearing a US men's size 13, they're just slightly long and the volume is a little high, and just by dropping half a size, they just fit my feet beautifully. So if you have worn a pair of New Balance shoes before and you liked how they fit, stick to that size with both of these. Okay, so let's crack on with it, and we're going to start with the 880, which has 40.5 in the heel, 34.5 in the forefoot for a 6mm drop. Now, if you have run in the 880 before, let's just say version 14 before this one, it was actually an 8mm drop before that. And if we go back even further, the 880 was a 10mm drop. So 40.5, 34.5, 6mm drop. Let's just head on over to the 1080, which has 38 in the heel, 32 in the forefoot, also for a 6mm drop. So even though this is their premium daily trainer, the 880 actually has 2.5mm more of stack height than the 1080. Does that matter to you? I really don't think it'll matter once I explain the shoes a little more, but it's the same drop. And I can only imagine that New Balance is finding that a 6mm drop is very popular. What are your thoughts? Is a 6mm drop kind of like the sweet spot? I know I like it. Now, let's talk about weight for just a second, because weight is an important part of any daily trainer. I mean, really, any running shoe. But for the 880, New Balance claims that in the US men's size 9, the 880 would tip the scale at 8.4 ounces or 238 grams. However, in my size, a US men's size 12.5, the 880 would tip the scale at 12.3 ounces or 348 grams. Okay, so keep those numbers in mind, and let's move over to the 1080 version 14. Now, in a US men's size 9, New Balance claims that the 1080 will tip the scale at 10.5 ounces or 298 grams. However, in my size, a US men's size 12.5, the 1080 tips the scale at 11.8 ounces or 335 grams. So that means that the 1080 in my size weighs 13 grams less than the 880. So that's probably exactly what we would expect. We're paying a little more, we're getting a little lighter shoe. However, 13 grams isn't that much. And when I was running with them, like one on each foot, honestly, the weight discrepancy wasn't really noticeable. So let's talk about each of these shoes and see where they differ and see where they're the same. Now I'm going to hold this up right here so you can see the heel collar of the 880, and you can see it is very padded. Now, if I hold up the heel collar of the 1080, again, very padded. Now look, if I hold them up both together, you can see that they are very similar in the amount of padding around the heel collar. However, when I look very closely, it seems that the 880 has just a little thicker padding than the 1080. Which again, I can justify in my mind because New Balance is trying to make a slightly lighter shoe with a 1080. But as far as comfort goes, as far as step in and comfort around the heel collar, they felt very similar to me. Like the couple millimeters of less padding on the 1080 made no difference. Now, if we look at the heel counter on both of the 880 and the 1080, the 880 is very rigid. The 1080 is also very rigid. Both the 1080 and the 880 have a slightly raised heel pull right on the back in case you want to grab on and help pull that shoe on. Again, as usual, these are daily trainers with rigid heel counters. There is really no need to pull this on. You can just step into the shoe and seat your foot how you like it. For the upper on the 880, New Balance is using a engineered structured mesh. For the upper on the 1080, New Balance is using a triple jacquard mesh, which sounds a lot better. Although, by feel, if I feel both of these, and by looks, the mesh is fairly similar. At least fairly similar in thickness and in feel. Now, the patterns of the mesh on both shoes are going to be just a little different, but as far as breathability goes, at least here in the toe box, I think the 1080 and the 880 are going to be very similar. Now, the tongue on the 880 it's as we would expect with a $140 daily trainer. It's quite thick, but not too thick. It is gusseted, and there is no lace loop here on the front. So it is nice to see that New Balance has included the gusseted tongue in this $140 880. Now, the tongue on the 1080, let me just remind myself of my thoughts by feeling both at the same time. Yeah, now the tongue on the 1080, it feels just slightly thicker than that on the 880. I don't think it's really noticeable. In fact, when I put them up next to each other and I'm looking at the tongues, they look very similar, as in similar in thickness. And the tongue on the 1080 is gusseted, same way it is on the 880, and again, no lace loop on the front. As far as overlays go, yeah, New Balance is sticking to their recipe of styling on both shoes. We have the big N on the lateral side. We have a bigger N on the medial side of the 880, but we still got that little N on the lateral side of the 1080. Now let's come down to the midsole. Because with the 880, New Balance has actually made a big change. They've included Fresh Foam X in this version of the 880. Now, New Balance is also using Fresh Foam X in the 1080. So at this point, I want you to stop and reflect and remember that both of these shoes have a 6mm drop. They're fairly similar in stack height, with the 880 coming in just 2.5mm more. As far as the upper, the heel collar, the counter, it's all just very similar. And now we're using the same Fresh Foam X in both shoes. Well, the name is where the similarity ends, because they are two different formulations of Fresh Foam X. And this is where we're going to separate runners from either wanting to buy the 1080 or the 880. That is, unless you are very price conscious and you just cannot live without a $165 shoe, then obviously you'll be going for the 1080. But barring that reason, the difference between the durometer readings of the 1080 and the 880 are really going to be the one deciding factor. Now, before we talk about ride, let's just come down to the outsole. And again, I don't think there is enough information here by me holding this up for you to actually make a decision. Both have, I don't know, the same amount of outsole rubber. Obviously, the patterns are just a little different, but I think for outsole rubber coverage, we have effectively the same amount. Good amount up on the forefoot, and then good amount on the heel too. We can see the rubber on the 880 does come around the back, where we've got exposed Fresh Foam X here. On the 1080, as far as wear goes, yeah, they're both standing up pretty well. In fact, you know what? I've had the 1080s a lot longer than the 880s, but I think the outsole rubber on the 1080s are just looking a little better. But it's really not by much. That's not a reason to pick one over the other. I'm pretty sure that New Balance is using the same outsole rubber compound on both shoes. But anyway, let's talk about ride. And by ride, we are talking about the Fresh Foam X. Now, if you don't know anything about these New Balance shoes, the difference between the 1080 and the 880, the difference, in a nutshell, is that the 1080 is softer than the 880. And it doesn't take wearing both of these shoes, like one on each foot, to really feel the difference. The New Balance 1080 is just a lot softer. Now, saying that, the New Balance 1080 version 14 is a lot firmer than the versions before it. Like before, I found the 1080s to just be pillowy soft. I think New Balance has just tightened up that durometer to maybe make the 1080s a little more responsive, or at least responsive feeling. And I do like what they've done with the 1080. Now, the 880 on the other hand, and let me just bring you back to my full review of the 880. My very first run in this shoe was a 20-mile run, and my feet felt good at the end. However, saying that, for my taste, I did find the 880 just a little firm, and that is going to come down to personal preference. As I said, after a 3-hour long run in these shoes, my feet still felt good, but it wasn't just that same level of super plush comfort that I like when I'm going out for a long run. Now, because New Balance has tightened up the durometer on the 1080, I think that is going to make the 1080 a much better long run shoe. At least for someone like me that likes just a little softer touch on their shoes. Now remember, both these are using Fresh Foam X. However, I would not describe the 880 as being a bouncy shoe, like not in the slightest. It's quite firm, and because it's quite firm, it gives you the illusion of road feel, so you're going to feel that energy coming back to you, so you may be able to pick up the pace a little better. In the 880 than you will in the 1080, but ultimately that is kind of irrelevant because the 880 is not a speed shoe. I mean, unless you're buying one pair of shoes and you want to do everything in it and you don't plan on running long, yeah, I think the 880 will work just fine. But if you are going to be running, I don't know, let's just say higher mileage. Let's say you're going to be increasing your mileage and you might like a slightly softer landing, but definitely not too soft. I think maybe the 1080 is going to be the way to go for you. If you are anything like me, then yes, I think you will favor the 1080 over the 880 just because it's slightly softer. Now that became especially apparent when I went for a run with the 880 on one foot, the 1080 on the other, and I could really feel that the difference between these shoes were night and day. Now, standing still, they feel exactly the same, and that's because, as we've already found out, the uppers are similar, there's a similar amount of padding. On paper, they're very similar shoes, but underfoot, they are night and day. Oh, before I let you go, let's just do a quick flexibility test. Yeah, you can see the 880 is quite flexible. Let's try that with the 1080. Yeah, I'd say a little less flexible actually, but I don't know, that really means nothing because I didn't notice a difference in flexibility when I was out on the run. 1080 was still just a little softer, a little more pleasing ride. But one thing's for sure, New Balance makes some pretty solid shoes, and they are going to sell a lot of the 880 because at $140, I think it's an absolute steal. I do understand that $165 is quite a bit more money, but the ride is superior, at least in my opinion, and that would be my pick between the two. So now I want to hear from you. Have you run in either the New Balance 880 or the 1080? Drop a comment and let me know. But for now, it's Matt B. This has been a shootout between the New Balance 880 version 15 and the New Balance 1080 version 14. Be kind, be happy, run well. See you in a couple of days.